All right, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Uh, Tuesday, October 17th, our Bud Metheny chapter meeting for the month of October. We have our chapter member, Paul Boren, giving us a presentation on baseball and labor from the mid-60s to the mid-70s. Paul does a wonderful job with these presentations, and I'm looking forward to hearing about this one. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Boren. Paul,
Okay,
it's all yours.
thank you guys. I also like to welcome to this group my wife, who's wondering what I've been doing, and I married well. She loves baseball. Um, hey, reduce the images of people's faces. My face is not going to play any role on this, and maximize the PowerPoint if you have it. So just minimize those video boxes. We'll chat afterwards. Um, This is about baseball and labor from 65 to 75, when literally they changed their way of working, the way of thinking themselves. They were gig workers and then they became union men. And this is derived from a presentation that I gave last spring. I retired, but I also teach Lifetime Learning Institute at College of William and Mary for baseball history and music history. And during that process of teaching it was a 6-week course. There was obviously who won the World Series, the stars, and so forth. But I thought that at that time, baseball was catching up with America. And America was well ahead of baseball and had to catch up. And particularly these 5 areas, I thought reflected that efforts to catch up. One was expansion, when new clubs moved in the suburbs and west and to the south, and more clubs came about. Second was integration, where more African Americans, Latinos were coming into play. And third was the Major League Draft, which offered a mechanism for the smaller clubs to move up. And from that, we get Oakland A's, small town teams like Oakland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh won World Series, Baltimore. TV broadcasting generated more fans and more money, but baseball slipped behind football, NFL. It didn't play as well on TV. And finally, labor and management, and the workers wanted their share. So my presentation tonight carves out that last point, labor and management, from this class that I gave. And what we're going to talk about tonight is the money, legal stuff, changes in the 60s, and then the impact of that money. Okay, so let's start out with the money, because it's all about the money. Okay, I want to compliment. I took this material from Michael Hubbard, who is a SABR leader. He's on the board, as I recall. He's in charge of the research committee on baseball. And much of my course takes advantage of SABR membership and knowledge. And the way you read this chart, there are 3 across the top: total TV revenue, average ticket price, the average player salary. And this was what it was in 1964, and then updated to $24. So let's look at total TV revenue, because that was the big source of money. In 64, they earned 21 million for that, which is equating to 206 million in today's dollars. Just as a point of comparison, baseball pulls in 1.2 million from TV revenue between networks and regional cable. And as you see, from 64 to 69, over a period of 5 years, the revenue went up about 50%. Ticket prices stayed the same. 225 here, 261, but that's really inflation driven, because the price of the ticket, the true price of the ticket, from 64 to 69 dropped down in $23. Average player salary started out in today's dollars at 144,000 for the average player. By 1969, it was 204,000 in today's dollars. So that went up about 40%. Not as much as the television revenue, but it still went up. And a lot of that occurred 67, really 68 and 69. Okay. Let's talk about legal stuff. Baseball's reserve clause system and its antitrust exemption, which are the two pillars of how baseball owners ran their business up until 1975. The reserve clause system dates back to 1879 when the National League decided that they were going to put a reserve clause in each of the contracts for up to 10 players on the team, 11th and 12th, whatever, they could go anywhere they want. And the antitrust exemption dates to 1921. We're going to go through each one of these. And as Chelsea points out, Chelsea James, a great post sport columnist, teams could suppress wages and dictate business in ways that no other business in America had the opportunity to do that. So what is a reserve clause? Here's an example one on the left, but it's really a clause that was never well defined. It was written, said that the player signed the contract for 1 year. If he chose not to take a new contract, management had the option to renew his contract. Now, most people would regard that as 1 year with an option. Major League Baseball thought of it as a continuous option that renewed, because I renewed you on the option, I don't renew you after that, I renew you after that. That was never really tested in the market until the Federal League came about, 1914 to 15, when 172 players left the National League and the American League for the Federal League. And the league was called an outlaw league because they were signing players who broke the reserve clause. The league lasted 2 years, and about 30 or 40% of the Federal League players made it back to the major leagues or to the minors. And the Federal League, when they folded, sued the National League and the American League for violation of the Sherman antitrust law. Now, what is the Sherman antitrust law? It was created in 1890, 2 years after the reserve clause was first started, and it prohibited anti-competitive agreements and unilateral conduct that mobilizes or attempts to mobilize the market. And one would think that the reserve clause would be one of those targets. So when the Federal League took it to court, they actually had Judge Kennesaw Landis as their judge before he was commissioner. And he kind of slow rolled it, encouraged a settlement. But it went to the Supreme Court in 1921. And the Supreme Court decided that Major League Baseball was an amusement, not interstate commerce. And therefore, antitrust laws didn't apply, and there was no need to address the reserve clause. It was an amusement because everything happened at that ballpark. Now, granted, the Yankees traveled from New York to Detroit, but that said, all the entertainment was in that ballpark and therefore was not subject to the Interstate Commerce Clause. In 1953, there was another Supreme Court case involving a Yankees minor league pitcher who sued the Yankees because he said he's a major league pitcher, but he's stuck in the farm system and bound there by the reserve clause. Supreme Court said, well, you know, Congress has had 30 years to look at this, and they haven't said anything wrong with our decision. So since Congress didn't act, we're not going to change our decision of 1921. Now, Congress didn't say the reserve clause was wrong or the Antitrust Act was wrong, nor did they say it was right. They just didn't act on it. In the 50s, there were congressional hearings, decided whether or not it must be legal to overturn it or not. And they just looked at it and concluded that if the Supreme Court didn't change it, Congress shouldn't change it either. But most of the hearings dealt with, they were leveraged to create expansion or move teams. And some were quite comical. And hopefully the sound will come on in this one. Let me know.
There is now, through the farm system, a major league control of the professional occupation of baseball playing. Is that a correct summary?
Well, you have that, from the standpoint of what you've been reading, you've got that down very good. I said, just like I made a talk not long ago, and I told them all when they was drinking and they invited me in, I said, you ought to be home. You men are not making enough money. You can't drink like that. They said, this is a holiday for the Shell Oil Company. And I said, why is it a holiday? They said, we did something great for 3 years, and we are given 2 days off to watch the Yankees play the White Sox, but they were mostly White Sox rooters. I said, well, you're not doing right. I said, you can't take those drinks and all, even on your holidays. You ought to be home and raising more children, because the big league clubs now give you $100,000 for a bonus to go into baseball. And by the way, I don't happen to have any children, but I wish Mrs. Stengel and I had 8. I'd like to put them in on that bonus rule.
You might have noticed in the background that Mickey Mantle and Ted Williams are sitting there and chuckling, and the next person up was Mickey, and they asked him, what do you think, Mickey? And he says, well, I always agree with Casey. Played it safe there. But the owners really didn't have much to say. Now we're going to talk about change in the 1960s and baseball players and what that brought about. And I was trying, as I get ready for this presentation, trying to find some reflection of change in baseball. And I was looking at minorities, I was looking at old-timers, talking to new players, and I decided Joe Pepitone here with his hairdryer probably reflects how baseball players had changed more than anything else. Baseball player is an employee in 1967. Players were bound to a team for life, de facto, because of the reserve clause. No say on the schedule, housing, spring training. They could be traded without regard to personal issues. They could be demoted to the minors and their salary cut. They could be released with only 10 days' pay. And the salary could be cut 25% each year back to minimum pay. Minimum salaries in 67 were worth $53,000 in today's money. The average salary was much more, 171. Now, how did they pull this off? Well, mostly because the owners liked that. They wanted to keep it that way. They refused to deal with agents. They said if you jumped to another league, Mexican or whatever, you were barred for life. Players were forced to basically sign contracts on owners' terms. Myths were created saying that they were looking out for them, that you can't have all the money that the team has. These guys, your teammates, have to have it. It was a professional, it was like a naive person going to a timeshare presentation. They were just ripe for picking. The players didn't really know what to do. And the hustlers did the hustling. But this was the 60s. And the whole attitude of what I'm entitled to and what's right and what's wrong changed. Because the generation before had grown up during the Depression or before the Depression, and they were just glad to have a job. Now we had some people born during World War II or baby boomers who had different values, different judgment of what they were entitled to. Also, during this time, you had some offenses or some actions taken by owners that really annoyed the players. In 1961, the owners took money out of the pension fund to pay the owner's tax bill. From 62 to 66, owners' income tripled, but the pension fund sources were cut. Seasons were extended by 8 games, basically 2 weeks, and the players were not given any choice on the matter. It's sort of like having to work overtime without any extra pay. Minimum salaries not increased. So the players decided to hire a full-time director and legal staff. And as a result, Major League Baseball was created. Now we're going to shift from 66 to 69. And I'm going to go through these 7 events which I think did a great deal to change the attitude by the players to turn them from gig workers into union men, hardcore union men. We're going to start with the famous holdout by Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale. The number one pitching combination of baseball with the number one starter with Koufax and Drysdale on the second day. And between them, they would have a career of 4 Cy Youngs and 1 MVP and multiple World Series MVPs. In '65, Koufax had won the World Series MVP, the Cy Young, and had a 27-9 record with a 1.73 ERA. He was offered $100,000 for the following year for '66. Drysdale was offered $85,000, and everybody expected him to take what was given. But they decided to have a mutual holdout, not to break the reserve clause, just to negotiate together as a team. I'll let you read what Sandy says himself. That was considered radical at the time, the right to negotiate. And what they really wanted, this is what they asked for: 3-year contracts, not year by year, at $160K per year. Use an agent for the negotiations, and use arbitration to resolve any salary disputes. It's a long time ago in today's baseball knowledge. What they finally agreed after a 27-day holdout was a 1-year contract. Both Koufax and Drysdale got increases of pay of $25K over the original offer. They could use a lawyer, but not for negotiating. Okay. Now, that was a very successful holdout, but the key to it was that they did it together. The power of 2 people sticking together. Okay. Most people were strongly opposed to what Koufax and Drysdale did. They thought they were ungrateful. How can you ask for so much money when teachers are getting so much less than firemen? Well, there are hundreds and thousands of teachers in America at the time, and same with firemen. The best teachers, probably university professors, get paid a lot more, and they have the right to move around. Imagine if you were a taxi driver signing a contract with Yellow Taxi, and they say, okay, we're going to pay you this much. And also, if you note here, you can only work for Yellow Cab. You can't go to Red Cab. You can't go to Uber. You can't drive a truck. You can't drive a bus. You can't drive anywhere but our cab company. Now, you can go off and get a job as a waiter, but if you're driving, you're only driving us for the rest of your life. In 1966, baseball players also created the Players Association. Now, the Players Association really is the players, the coaches, and the trainers. But the big beneficiaries are the players. It's only major league players, not minor league players. Before then, they used lawyers for various efforts. A lawyer by the name of Lewis was very successful in getting them pensions and healthcare, and getting the pensions and healthcare funded primarily through the All-Star game, and later a little bit from the World Series. Players wanted him to do more and to work full time, but Lewis said, look, you guys don't even know what you want, don't realize how powerful you are. I've got other clients who clearly know what they want and clearly are powerful. I'm taking off. So they hired this guy, Robert Cannon, who fancied himself more as a statesman as opposed to their lawyer, and was conceded many rights to the lawyers, to the owners. He actually wanted to be baseball commissioner in 1969, and later became a partial owner of the Milwaukee Braves. This man was extremely popular, with the owners. And when the players decided that they were going to create a players association, there were really only two candidates, Cannon and another one we'll talk about in a moment. Cannon was so popular with the owners that they offered to provide his pay, provide his office space, and pay for his staff. But the players picked this guy, Marvin Miller, who in my opinion is one of the four most important people in baseball history. Babe Ruth, Jackie Robinson, Branch Rickey, and Marvin Miller. He created more change in the 15 years in baseball, the 15 years that he was the executive director, than anybody else did. It was phenomenal impact. He turned them, as I said, from gig workers to the most powerful union probably in America. Now, the owners hated Marvin Miller even before they ever met him. And Miller was a college-educated economist who had worked for the United Steelworkers Union as an organizer. He had a long track of success. And the owners said, he's going to turn you into picket line walkers and thugs and goons. You don't need that. But as Jim Bouton says, of course we knew that. We needed that. Before he came on, the players didn't really appreciate what a union could do for them. I'll let Joe Torre tell you about that.
Mm.
And Tim McCarver. Miller had two goals. He wanted the players to learn the power of collective actions as opposed to gig work. And they wanted to sign a collective bargaining agreement, which made it possible for them to work collectively in dealing with the owners. Now, his primary approach was to educate and listen. Never take the players too far that they didn't feel comfortable for. The players decided what they were going to do. He just provided them options and possible outcomes. So the union had more than trust in them. They started believing in themselves. We're going to talk next about Ken Harrelson, who became a free agent in 1967, although I use that term free agent somewhat loosely. Harrelson was a right fielder for the Kansas City Athletics, making $12,000 a year in that time. And he was really an average player. I looked up his performance stats up until that time, and in 67, he was probably the 14th best right fielder in major leagues out of 20. So he wasn't awesome. He would have good years follow, but at this point, he was just what we call a three outcome hitter: walk, strikeout, and home run. He got into a verbal match with his owner, Charlie Finley, which was pretty easy to do, actually, after Finley punished one of his pitchers on the team, which even the manager said he didn't deserve. Krause didn't deserve that punishment. So Harrelson complained publicly to the press, and then Finley called a press conference where Harrelson expected to apologize in front of the press to Finley. Harrelson refused. He didn't say, I'm not even going. He said other words, too, that I'm not going to mention. Finley placed Harrelson on irrevocable waivers. He made him a free agent. In August, in 1967, pennant races. You can buy yourself a good right fielder. And the bidding war started for Harrelson. He was signed by the Red Sox because Tony Conigliaro had been badly hurt with a hit pitch, and they had a definite need for a right fielder. They signed him for $150K a year, it was called, up from $12K. You get paid by the game. So his pay actually increased per game by 12.5%, factor of 12.5. That was, to major league players, a clear indication of what their true market value was on the open market. Collective bargaining agreement 1, signed February 1968 after over a year of stonewalling by the owners. And only the threat of a spring training boycott brought this about. And as I mentioned, Marvin Miller believed that you should have some tangible benefits for the players, and they got that. And they should always negotiate and put into the agreement things that you don't get 100% of. You just get it there on paper and get the ball rolling for the next collective bargaining agreement. So from Miller's standpoint, the first goal was to get a collective bargaining agreement. The owners now accepted that there was a union. Second was a procedure for grievances. Before then, you had no procedure. You didn't like what's happening, too bad. And finally, they decided to have a study committee to look at the reserve clause and the length of the season. Now, nobody expected any results from the study committee, and as a matter of fact, it never met. But the fact that they got those two down meant that next time you can raise it up again and negotiate from it. Following this, spring training in 1969, there was a boycott of players because of the pension. Now, the pension fund and the CBA are two different legal arrangements. Pension fund goes back to the early 50s. And as I said, it's based on revenue from the All-Star game and sometimes from the World Series. Well, the revenue from the All-Star game and the World Series was based on paid attendance, but TV revenue was pouring in. And those two sources of revenue were left out of the pension fund for those events. 400 players boycotted spring training. Players were encouraged not to sign contracts until they got to spring training. Some did, some famous ones like Carl Yastrzemski. But the owners decided they were going to play tough, and they were going to bring in minor leaguers. And we're going to start the season with these minor leaguers. And NBC said, no, 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 no. We're paying major league prices. We're not paying for minor league games. So Bowie Kuhn stepped in and said, settle this. And in fact, they yielded to virtually everything that the players wanted. Most importantly, TV revenue went into the pensions, and you were fully vested for pension health benefits now after 4 years. Before it was 5 years. I'm going to talk now about Don Clendenin. And Ed Hoyt at SABR wrote a very good article. Don Clendenin in 64, before the start of the season, after the strike was settled, vowed to retire rather than accept a trade from Montreal to Houston. Now, let's go into a little bit of background. Don Clendenin was a rather unusual man. His biological father passed away when Don was age 6, but his biological father was two PhD professor at a college in Kansas. His mom remarried to this man on the right, Nish Williams, who was a Negro League star, a catcher. And Nish had many people visited him because he had a restaurant in Atlanta, a successful one. He was a middle class person. And some of those people were guys like Jackie Robinson, Satchel Paige, and such. And Nish taught Don to be a baseball player. He wanted him to be a baseball player. Clendenin was a big, strapping guy. He was probably more built for tight end or basketball, which he was good at both. But Nish said, I'm going to teach you how to hit the curveball. And what he did is he constructed a wire fence held together by 2x4s and put it just on the outside edge of the batter's box. And told Don to get in there. And then he invited his old buddy Satchel Paige to throw curveballs to Don. And if he clinched, as he normally did in the past, he would hit his back against that cage fence and then watch that ball break over the plate. And he wound up getting the hang of it and becoming an incredible curveball hitter, excuse me. Now, another thing, he went to Moorhead College, and when you get there, you wind up getting a mentor. Clendenin's minister was Martin Luther King. His son, Martin Luther King Jr., was at Divinity School and became the mentor for Don Clendenin.
Hmm.
So he is an atypical man for baseball. He was given a choice of signing with the Cleveland Browns or the Harlem Globetrotters after college. And he wanted to go to the Browns, but his dad said, please, please, try baseball. And actually, Branch Rickey spoke to Clendenin and said, you know, Jackie Robinson's first love was football, but he chose baseball because you can make more money in the long run. So he listened to that, and he wound up being a very good first baseman for Pittsburgh. He was comparable to Lee May or Norm Cash in terms of performance statistics over time. He was about the fourth best first baseman in the National League at that time. Okay. Now, after 1968, the Pirates had a young man by the name of Al Oliver who was coming up through the system. And baseball was expanding, and they could only protect so many people. And he was drafted by Montreal. Montreal took him and then traded him to Houston in exchange for Rusty Staub. There were other guys involved, but that's the bottom line trade. Montreal loved Rusty Staub. They put him in the preseason program. They were talking about how great he was. But Clendenin says, I'm not going to Houston. Now, before I tell you why, let's go one step more. When he graduated from Morehouse, he continued on his career. He studied at Duquesne Law at night. He was actually admitted to Harvard Law, but there was no way he could go to Harvard Law and play baseball at the same time. He also worked at Mellon Bank, the Allegheny County Sheriff's Office, U.S. Steel. And in 1968-69, he was working as personnel manager for Scripto Pen Company in Atlanta. He also took over his stepfather's nightclub and restaurant. Scripto Pen, we all probably remember, had a large employee base. This was back when they were assembling pens by hand. And so personnel manager was a pretty important job at that point. And he said, listen, I'm not going to go to Houston. I'm going to retire. And the reason he wanted to retire instead of go to Houston was he hated the manager, Harry Walker. Harry Walker he had played for previously in Pittsburgh. And Harry Walker was one of the, when Jackie Robinson first broke into baseball, he was one of the Dodgers that created a petition to say, Jackie Robinson doesn't play here, or if he does, we ain't playing here. And Walker was traded by Branch Rickey to get him off the team. Lots of players have said that, Joe Morgan, for example, has said that Harry Walker, I'm not going to use the word racist, but they did. So Kuhn had a problem, and he didn't want the real reason from Clendenin to get out, and he didn't want to have trades negated on him either. And Montreal wanted Staub because, as I said, he already put him in the program. So they had a meeting, Kuhn, with the owner of the Montreal team and the Houston team, and Clendenin. And the owners had accused publicly, or at least through Kuhn, that Clendenin was doing this, and he was funded by some outside group, conspiracy theory, that he couldn't possibly leave baseball. Nobody leaves baseball on their own terms. So Clendenin brought with him his boss, the president of Scripto. to prove that he had a job. And Kuhn and the two owners were incensed. Who is this guy? What's he doing here? You shut up. Don't tell me who you are. And before they knew it, they had an argument going on. Kuhn said, okay, you can stay, but you're not allowed to say anything. Point taken that Don Clendenin had options. What was finally agreed, I'm going to mention also the Houston owner later threatened to buy out Scripto pens so he could fire the president and then fire Don Clendenin. Sore loser. Kuhn actually worked it out so that Montreal would send a pitcher to Houston. Montreal would keep Staub and Clendenin. And Clendenin got a sizable raise. He got bumped up to $35,000 a year and a multiple, I think it was a 3-year contract. So word got out that Clendenin scored big time by nixing the train because he had options. So you had these rumors and these circulations between Sandy Koufax and Drysdale and Harrelson and Clendenin that they'll give you the money. You just got to act the right way to get it. Well, Curt Flood really tested this. We all know that Curt Flood was traded for Dick Allen in 1969 after the end of the season. And I'm going to let Curt tell you in his own words.
I guess you really have to understand who that person, who that Curt Flood was. I'm a child of the 60s, a man of the 60s. During that period of time, this country was coming apart at the seams. We were in Southeast Asia. Good men were dying for America and for the Constitution in the southern part of the United States. We were marching for civil rights, and Dr. King had been assassinated, and we lost the Kennedys. And to think that merely because I was a professional baseball player, I could ignore what was going on outside the walls of Busch Stadium is truly hypocrisy. And now I find that all of those rights that these great Americans were dying for, I didn't have in my own profession.
In October of 1969, veteran center fielder Curt Flood of the St. Louis Cardinals got word that he was to be traded to Philadelphia. The Phillies were a second division team known for their hostility toward black players, and Flood did not wish to move his family or to leave his business interests behind.
I often wondered, what would I do if I were ever traded? Because it happened many, many times. It was, in quote, part of the game. And then suddenly it happened to me. I was leaving probably one of the greatest organizations in the world to, at that time, was probably the least liked. And by God, this is America. And I'm a human being. I'm not a piece of property. I'm not a consignment of goods.
Flood did not report to the Phillies training camp. I am a man, he told Baseball Commissioner Bowie Kuhn.
Dear Mr. Kuhn, after 12 years in the major leagues, I do not feel that I am a piece of property to be bought and sold irrespective of my wishes. I believe that any system which produces that result violates my basic rights as a citizen and is inconsistent with the laws of the United States. It is my desire to play baseball in 1970, and I am capable of playing. I received a contract from the Philadelphia club, but I believe I have the right to consider offers from other clubs before making any decisions. I therefore request that you make known to all Major League clubs my feelings in this matter and advise them of my availability for the 1970 season. Sincerely, Curt Flood.
The commissioner refused to exempt him from the reserve clause. Flood refused to play and vowed to take his case all the way to the Supreme Court. The century-old struggle between the owners and the players was approaching a climax.
Now, Flood needed legal help, and paying for that was expensive, particularly if you think you're going to go to the Supreme Court. So he told his story and his desires to the Players Association board, and they agreed to fund and pay for his legal bills. While that court case was going on, working its way through the system, another collective bargaining agreement was done. It raised minimum allowances, cash allowances, and so forth. But that fourth line, agents were now allowed to negotiate the contracts. And what the owners thought was a throwaway concession, impartial arbitrator for grievance, except in cases involved the integrity of the game. What that meant is the commissioner was going to be the so-called impartial arbiter. Now, I'm going to tell you, Louis Kuhn was not impartial. He, in fact, had argued for Major League Baseball as a lawyer back in 1951 against Tolson versus the Yankees. He had a long history of supporting the owners. He was actually Major League Baseball's lawyer before he was made commissioner. But once again, you put it in this concession, in this CBA, maybe you'll get it more in the next one. They agreed to table the reserve clause because of the Supreme Court process. In June 72, Supreme Court came out 5-3 to uphold the federal baseball decision of 1921-22 and reject Flood's claim. Harry Blackman wrote the opinion. The first multiple pages was Blackman's ode to baseball. He wrote his 100 favorite baseball players into the court decision. Before he got around to the legal aspect, which said Congress has had 50 years to review this, and it's taken no action. So therefore, through positive inaction, we have to support the precedent that we have before us, stare decisis, or however you lawyers say it, and let the judgment stand. Reserve clause and antitrust exemptions were not changed. The next CBA, some important concessions by owners. The players didn't ask for much for money, but they worked on these things. After 5 years, players could not be sent down to minors without consent. Players with 10 years of service time or 5 or more, like Curt Flood, must approve trades. And finally, neutral, and the key word there is neutral binding arbitration for all players with 2 or more years experience. Neutral would be a situation where you would have an owner's rep, player's rep, and an outsider, a professional arbitrator, decide. In 1975, all hell broke loose. An arbitration came up involving Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally. Now, McNally was retiring, but Messersmith was one of the best pitchers in baseball at that time. He had won 20 games in 74. The Dodgers offered him $100,000. He said, listen, I want in my contract to refuse to be traded, a no trade clause. And they said, no way. And he said, okay, how about I approve where I get traded to? And they said, no way. So Messersmith decided not to sign his contract, to play the option year. The reserve clause was you sign your contract. If you don't sign the new one, you get to play under the old one under the option. So the issue was, what did that reserve clause really mean? Did it mean, like the owners did, an indefinite reserve clause lasting until you died? Even if you came back at age 65, you had to go back to the same team that you played for at 35. Or did it mean 1 year with an option? Well, the deciding vote came down to Peter Sitz, who is a professional arbiter, who wrote a very basic, straightforward position that it's 1 year with an option. Messerschmitt is a free agent, and so is McNally. Now, Messerschmitt wound up signing with the Braves, and there was an informal boycott of him by collusion would be the right word among the owners. Nobody wanted to offer Messerschmitt more than 100,000 until Ted Turner bought the Braves, and he gave him much, much more. He gave him enough money for everybody to say, "Yep, this is what we're going to do from right now." And the owners immediately recognized what was going to happen. Players would sign a contract, play out their option, and become free years. So the next CBA was signed where the players could become free agents after 5 years. And after year 2, years 3, 4, 5, they could go to arbitration, where one side would say I'm worth 200,000, the other side said 500,000, and the arbiter would look at what you might say comps. What was your other players in your pay range or your performance range getting? And if it was on the high end or low end, that's where he would rule. Well, what was happening is that players were getting a lot of money now through arbitration. And guess what? They wanted it. This is what happened. The orange line is the league minimum, doesn't go up much. The blue line is the Major League Baseball average. And most of that went up because of arbitration, not from free agency, but arbitration. Because not too many baseball players made it to 5 years for free agency. A fair number did at first because they had been with the same team for a while. But most of this is due to arbitration. Now I'm going to go back to Michael Hopper's, and we're going to look at what's the impact of all this money. This is in real dollars from 2023, all the money. I didn't go back to actuals at the time, but the real money today. And you look here at the mean, the minimum, the mean, and the maximum of baseball salaries in 1920 was equivalent to about $78K. And you understand why players would be working in the off season by and large. There was no minimum, and they definitely did work in the off season. The maximum, I think this is Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb, made in today's dollars, 314. 1950 rolls around, the average goes up in today's dollars, and this is Joe DiMaggio out here with 1.2 million. Willie Mays has got 1960 and 1970 totals, and Nolan Ryan's out here in 80. And this is Max Scherzer. So the mean goes up, and the super free agents go up quite a bit. The average ticket price didn't go up, actually went down in the 1980s. And I think a lot of that is because they went to bigger stadiums with cheap seats in the outfield. And then now it's $36. This is all from 2023 dollars. And so you see it's approximately doubled from the good old days of 1920s and 50s. But the franchise value keeps going up and up and up. Is 12.3 million in today's dollars. A small business back in 1920. Individuals own the team. 32 million in 50, 57 million, 80 million, 123 million, and then boom, 2.3 million. Now, why is it going up? Well, it's not ticket prices. There's more TV revenue coming in. There's social media. There's merchandising. When I was a kid, you couldn't get uh, a game uniform. You couldn't get a replica. Or you couldn't even get a hat unless you went to Hat Day. Now that's all for sale. Um, Many other sources of revenue, such as ballparks with expensive suites, uh, and now there is things called gambling, where more money is coming in. So what does this tell you? Well, it tells you that while the players have improved their stake, the owners have stayed rich, gotten richer. The rich know how to get richer. Let's look at it one more way, which is the total team payroll. 25-man payroll was about 90% of all expenses for a team. And you see it keeps going up and up and up till its average in 22 was 111 million. Franchise value was 2.3 billion. And the ratio from franchise to payroll went from 6-3, 13, 14 to 1 to now 21 to 1. So really don't feel sorry for owners. They are rich people getting richer. They get their return on investment when they sell. Okay. I'd leave you with this thought, shared by both an owner and a player. I'll let you read it. And with that, let's turn to questions.
Well,
All right, does anybody have any questions or thoughts for Paul? Nice, that's well done, Paul. Very, very well done, very educational. Appreciate that.
yes, Carl, thanks from me as well. It was great. Why was Kurt Flood disliked quite a bit by the players themselves and had problems with what he was doing? Any thoughts on it?
Yeah, as you could tell, it was very personal and emotional to him. First of all, he had an established business in St. Louis, and he didn't want to leave it. He would have to close it. He had many personal family ties in St. Louis, and when he went to the MLB Players Association for legal aspects, for legal support, he stated he didn't think it was right. But everybody was like, "This is what baseball. You get traded, man. What's going on?" And I think it was McCarver that asked him, because he was in the trade. McCarver was part of the trade to Philly. He said, "Is this racial in some way?" And Flood, after a long pause, said, "Well, yeah, it is. It's. I feel like it's enslavement." Now, very few baseball players are as enlightened as Kurt Flood, or have a career options as Don Clendenin. Most of them were just happy to be here. They wanted more. They would like better combinations, but most of them were slow to grasp the larger picture. And this was a very bold move, very public move, and it was caught on. I shouldn't say caught on. The media, people like Howard Cosell, made a big deal about it. So there was some pushback from that.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Well, I wonder, Paul, if some of that wasn't also that both McClendon and Flood were well-educated black men, and they were pushing back against the white establishment, and the clubhouses weren't. I mean, at that point in time, if there were one or two or maybe three black ball players on a club, that was a big deal. So I wonder how much of that was people were they weren't appreciative of the intelligence shown by Flood and or McClendon during that time.
I agree with part of that. Clendenin was extraordinarily popular among the players. When he went to the Mets, many of the Mets basically credit for him for turning them around and making them believe that they were a winner in '69.
Mm.
And Flood was introverted. I don't know if you want to say moody, but he was pensive and not an outgoing, gregarious fellow. He was introspective. So it helps to be a leader and popular in life. But yeah, I believe, if Mickey Mantle had done it, it would have been a completely different reaction too.
Paul, what
Paul,
happened to? I'm sorry.
right.
What
Go ahead,
happened
Michael.
to? What happened to Richie Allen or Dick Allen when the trade didn't go through with Curt Flood?
He did, as I recall, he did go. They found, I can't remember who replaced Curt Flood on the trade, and then Dick was eventually traded to the White Sox, where he was much more successful. Because he actually was playing for a person he knew, Chuck Tanner. He and Chuck grew up in the same town, I think, certainly the same county. And Tanner was more of a player's manager who let them do their stuff as long as you showed up in time and did your thing and gave them respect.
Thank you.
Paul, what back in the 20s, when Major League Baseball was deemed to be a amusement, how come football and basketball didn't get the same exemption? Now, I know they weren't as popular back then, obviously, and the NFL was still kind of a rogue kind of league with changing franchises, multiple changes in franchises every year. But neither of those two sports were ever considered an amusement, as far as I recall.
Well, interestingly enough, boxing tried to get a reserve clause.
Really?
And boxing was big time stuff. Uh, and that was struck down. I can't remember where they tried to get it, either through Congress or through the Supreme Court. Boxing was probably corrupt too. But I just think that basketball and football at that time in the 20s and 30s and so forth were minor league. Now, there were two professional football leagues in the 40s that eventually merged, and then in the 60s that eventually merged. So the idea of jumping around was out there for a lot of the guys. And there were actually two professional basketball leagues in the 40s through 1950s until they merged into the NBA. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure why they weren't they didn't try reserve clauses, but they didn't, is the bottom line.
Do you think that the presence of the reserve clause actually helped the players develop what is now the most powerful professional athletic union? They had more to fight for because they had a reserve clause to fight against, where football never had a reserve clause, basketball never had a reserve clause.
I'll say yes, but I also think it was the timing that they fought. Mm-hmm. In the 1890s, the Players League was formed to combat the reserve clause, but they couldn't succeed financially. And the Federal League had their own reserve clause. If you signed with the Federal League, you were guaranteed a 5% increase every year. And if you stay with the team after 10 years, you could become a free agent. They weren't exactly the most liberated crowd, but they were better than the American League and the National League. But the timing in the 60s, you had players, as I said, who, and Kurt Flood said better than I can, lots of things were happening, and self-awareness was coming in and even into the clubhouse. And the reserve clause was what made their pay low and kept them from moving on to another club where pay would be better or conditions would be better or other rights. So it was the object that everybody was fighting against.
Were there other attorneys other than Marvin Miller that might have, from your study of this, might have succeeded to the degree that he did, or was he kind of one of a kind?
He wasn't an attorney; he was an economist.
Yes,
and a labor organizer.
Yeah.
Looking back, I can't tell you who the labor organizer for any other sports league was. There were obviously people like Shea, the great union in California, suddenly I can't remember his last name, who organized migrant workers, for example.
Cesar Chavez.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say Che Guevara, but I knew that was wrong. And there were other people who were prominent labor organizers who, in the right conditions, the right situation, where there was a lot to fight for and very little to lose, succeeded quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Walter Reuther or somebody like that.
Yeah.
Paul, wasn't there a time that when the team would name a player rep, I just seem to remember they'd name a player rep and then sometimes teams would get rid of that player rep, or maybe I'm remembering incorrectly.
Well, it depends on what the player rep tried to do. The player rep, I remember in Bowden's Ball 4, the player rep got a car provided to them as compensation from the Players Association. So it wasn't just headaches, there was a little bit of reward in it. And running for player rep, which was detailed in Ball 4, is a little bit of office politics too. There's got to be a guy who wants to do it, but he's got to be not perceived as too smart of a guy, a wise ass like Bowden was. And it was probably better that you weren't the all-star, the superstar, although many of them who were on the executive board were superstars. But because you didn't want to get asked too many questions in the media about this labor issue or that labor issue. So they tend to be guys who were second baseman or a relief pitcher or the fourth pitcher or something like that. And yeah, those guys got traded. Whether it was because they were reps or because they were tradable, I don't really know. But those people who made a big stink, who were and took on the wrong owner, somebody like Finley, were traded. That was kind of a rambling answer to yes, but not always. Anything else?
Marvin Miller was the speaker at the 2004 SABR National Convention.
Really?
And he told a very interesting story, which I think may be in, and if I'm inaccurate on this, Andy McHugh's book about Walter O'Malley, Mover and Shaker, that about the fact that Walter O'Malley, I, by the way, had the fortune to talk to Marvin Miller for a while because we were sitting at a table beside each other. I found him to be a very gentle, kind man. And I said that to somebody later on, and they said, well, you never negotiated against him. But he told this story in Cincinnati in his comments, I think, to the old convention, that on St. Patrick's Day, during the labor strife between the players and the owners, he was going around talking to each club. And he went to the Dodgers camp, spring training camp, and he took a vote every time he went to one of these major league spring training camps on who wanted to have a work stoppage and who wanted to play. And it was right around St. Patrick's Day, and and Walter O'Malley was in Vero Beach, and he was giving at his home or residence a St. Patrick's Day party. And Marvin Miller was approached by somebody who knew O'Malley and said, Walter wants you to come to the party. And this was just after he had taken this vote of the Dodgers players, of which I think there were 25 at the time. It was getting toward the end of spring training. And when he got to the party, Walter O'Malley called him up to his room, and they had a private conversation. And Marvin Miller said that O'Malley asked him, said, I want to know how the vote went. And Marvin Miller told him, well, it was 21 wanted to strike and 4 wanted to play. And he thought, and Walter O'Malley asked him, well, who were those 4 that wanted to play? And he thought, well, those guys will have pretty secure jobs. And before like mid-season, all 4 of those players who Marvin Miller didn't name were traded from the Dodgers. So later on, he asked Walter O'Malley, how did you find out? And Walter O'Malley said, well, I have ways of finding out, and I found out who they were. And he said, well, why did you trade the ones that voted to play and not have the work stoppage? And Walter O'Malley said, well, I didn't want 4 guys who wouldn't go with the rest of his teammates' wishes. And he thought that would destroy the Dodgers' success. And I think a lot of people found that story to be very interesting.
That is.
Counterintuitive, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else, guys?
Just, coincidentally, 2 nights ago, I was actually in Kennesaw, Georgia, at a concert, and my grandkids got a charge out of the fact that the commissioner of baseball many years ago was named after a mountain, Kennesaw Mountain. So, anyway,
Or was the mountain named after him?
that's right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So anyway.
All right, everybody. Paul, again, thank you. That was very well done, very, very insightful, and appreciated. Our next meeting is scheduled for November 14th. We're going to have author David Krell join us and talk about his book, Do You Believe in Magic? About the 1966 season. So if any of you have read it, awesome. Bring your questions. If those of us who haven't, throw the guy a bone and buy a book and read it before he shows up on November 14th.
And for anybody who wants, I have 2 copies of the book. I bought one when it first came out and never read it. It just got stuck in the bottom of my closet. Then I bought one when Drew, you sent out something a few months ago about it. And I bought it at that time with a SABR discount. So I have 2 copies. If anybody wants wants the book, let me know and I'll mail it to you, or I'll meet you for coffee and hand it to you or something like that. So just let me know.
I'll raise my hand.
Pardon me? What'd you say,
I'll,
Paul?
I'll say yes.
Okay. All right. I'll send it to you. You said you spoke up first, so I'll mail it to you.
All right.
Okay.
You want
We
to
live
copy
in
my
Williamsburg.
address?
Yeah, just send me an email with your address. Yeah.
Okay. I guess you're on the email list here. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'll do that.
Okay,
Thanks,
good. You're
Fred.
in Williamsburg, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's a little far to drive for coffee, I think.
Yeah. Well,
Hey,
yeah.
you can
I
read
hate that
Newport
tunnel.
News.
So I'll send it to you.
Yeah, rendezvous, Newport News at
Yeah.
the big airport there that never has any aircraft in it. Okay. All right, guys. Thank you very much.
All right,
Thank you.
Yeah,
all right, everybody.
very good.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
Playoffs.
And I'll send out a registration tomorrow for the next meeting. Take
Okay.
care.
I have one last
Thank you.
question. Does anybody really care about rooting for any of the 4 finalists in the playoffs?
Really rooting for them.
Well, I mean, is there a Diamondback fan out there? I don't know about, you know. All right.
Yeah.
I just don't want the Phillies to win.
You don't want the Phillies
My
to win.
man. My man.
No.
I don't want the Astros to win. So
Yeah, well, there you
okay.
go.
So we've narrowed those 2. All right, good. Thank you,
all
guys.
right.
Well, one thing about this, it is competitive so far. I mean, they're having some close ball games.
Right.
Yeah.
Phillies are up 2-0 already in the tonight's game. So those of you who don't have notifications on your phone.
I knew you weren't paying attention.
2 solo homers, Turner and Schwarber.
All right. Thank you.
Great.
See
All
you
right.
guys.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
All right.